7 o'clock, and we're bringing everyone on for our Listen, Learn, Lead virtual town hall. Give us a minute as we're bringing all the participants on. Welcome. Seeing some familiar faces here and there and some new faces. Okay, good evening, everyone. I am Brian Newman with Texas State Senator Angela Paxton, SD8. Welcome to SD8 country, Collin County in North Texas. And welcome to this month's Listen, Learn, Lead series, covering the future of Texas elections and election integrity. I'm serving as the moderator this evening, and I want to let everyone know that this event is being recorded for a future podcast. So you probably saw that alert box come up when you joined the Zoom. Senator Angela Paxton represents Senate District 8 in Collin County and North Dallas County. A small business owner with a bachelor's degree in math and computer science from Baylor University and a master's degree in education from the University of Houston Clear Lake. Senator Paxton was elected in 2018 after a 20-plus year career in education as a teacher and a school counselor. She serves as vice chair of the Senate Nominations Committee and also serves on the Senate Education, Business and Commerce, Higher Education, Local Government, and Redistricting Committees, as well as the Texas Sunset Advisory Commission. Senator Paxton was also recently appointed to serve on the Legislative Joint Oversight Committee on Investment in Information Technology Improvement and Modernization Projects, and the Texas Blockchain Work Group. Tonight, we also have the privilege of being joined by Texas Secretary of State, John Scott. Secretary Scott was appointed by Governor Greg Abbott to serve as the 114th Texas Secretary of State last month on October 21st, and that would be October 21st, 2021, last month. Secretary Scott has over 33 years of experience as an attorney, having successfully tried over 100 lawsuits and handled cases at the United States Supreme Court, also the Supreme Court of Texas, as well as state and federal appellate and district courts, winning historic courtroom victories. Prior to serving as Secretary of State, Scott served as Deputy Attorney General for Civil Litigation under then Attorney General Greg Abbott, and subsequently as the first Chief Operating Officer of the Texas Health and Human Services Commission. Some ground rules tonight for this virtual event. Number one, Senator Paxton and Secretary Scott will be the primary speakers during the Listen, Learn, Lead Town Hall. Senator Paxton will have some questions for Secretary Scott that are frequently asked of the Senate office. Number two, questions should be submitted through the chat window. You'll see that often at the bottom, a little icon that you could click on and a chat window will pop up. Guests will be recognized to ask questions on topics based on their submitted questions in the chat window. And the third rule, the moderator, me, will unmute the individuals who are recognized to ask a question. The moderator reserves the right to remove guests for improper comments. With that, I will turn it over to you, Senator Paxton. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Brian. I appreciate it. You always do such a great job, and I hope you don't get hired away to do radio or something like that. You got a great radio voice. Thank you all for being.
I hear I have a face for radio.
Well, I'm thrilled to work with you, Brian, and I'm just so glad to see everyone this week. This is probably the hottest topic next to border security for most of the year until the vaccine mandates kind of popped in. We've had a lot of hot topics this year. But prior to that, throughout most of the session, I would say that questions, inquiries, comments, communication to my office regarding election integrity was probably the most frequent communication that we received. And of course, it is essential and central to our form of government. I was just thinking recently about the founding of our nation. And, one of the things that our founders initially did, they put together the Declaration of Independence. And in that, they laid out why they were separating from the mother country of England. And basically, they talked about, this is the purpose of government. It is to secure the God-given rights of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Those are given by God, but they are secured and protected by government. And when government quits doing that or won't do their job, then it is the right and even duty of the people to find new guardians for their future and their posterity. And it is no wonder that at that time, they literally engaged in a war to secure new guardians. But they built into our Constitution the mechanism for regular assessment and turnover of leadership every 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, depending on the length of the term of the office. But they are elections. And so election security, election integrity is absolutely essential and critical to our form of government and to continuing to secure the rights that God has given us and that we enjoy so bountifully in this country of the United States and also in our state of Texas. And of course, that is my goal, is to keep our future free. And this is at the center of what it takes to do that. And to that end, one of the things that we're all aware of, we've talked a lot about Senate Bill 1, the election integrity bill that was passed in the regular, it got started in the regular session, and it took a couple of special sessions to finally get it done. But part of what is part of this entire process is the much anticipated audit. And it occurred to me recently, as we were preparing for this event tonight, that was going to be conducted by the Secretary of State. And I happen to know the Secretary of State. And you heard a wonderful biography of Secretary of State John Scott. And I've known John for a number of years. He is incredibly well qualified and incredibly well suited to this task. And Secretary, I just want to welcome you to Listen, Learn, Lead tonight, and really appreciate you making time to be with us. So thanks for being with us.
Senator, thank you so much for having me tonight.
Well, I'm glad for you to be here. And it also kind of occurs to me that many of the folks on this Zoom tonight have probably never seen a real live Secretary of State. And so here he is. He is a real person, and he is a really fine person too. So thanks for being with us, John. We did see last year an unprecedented number of government actions from many different angles many of them were related to COVID or exacerbated by COVID. But of course, there were certainly many that were of concern to citizens that related to our election process. We saw a lot coming out of Harris County. Election administrator authorized drive-through voting and pop-up tents in the county. Just kind of came up with this idea. In Tarrant County, the vote tabulation machines couldn't read the mail-in ballots properly. There was a problem, it appeared, with paper density. And so they called an audible and they transposed those ballots by hand, which of course was quite non-standard. The courts created an extra week of early voting for the November election. And whether you think that's good or bad or whatever, it was something that was interjected into the process that was non-standard. And then, of course, there were many people who attempted or did utilize mail-in ballots beyond the authorized use of disability, just on the grounds that they said they were concerned about getting sick or whatever. But it, again, was outside the bounds of what had been prescribed for our election process. So we do know that testimony, I heard it many times. If you were watching the testimony, you heard testimony related to individuals who had seen how mail-in ballots were stolen by vote harvesters. We did see that. We saw court records with individuals who had gone in to use a voting machine and someone approached them and said they were there to assist them. And then all of a sudden they realized that person just used them to vote in a way that didn't represent their vote. And of course, all of this should concern anyone. We want real elections. Again, going back to what we started with, it is at the center of our form of government to have free and fair elections. And many of you do remember when President Trump called for a full forensic audit of the election, citing many of the errors, anomalies, and inconsistencies that we saw in Texas, but across the nation with election processes and results. So we went into the session with the directive, my colleagues and I, that the public must have confidence in the outcomes of elections, and they must, in order to do that, have confidence in the procedures, in the consistency and accuracy. And so this is why I am so thankful to have on our call tonight Secretary John Scott. He is a man of intelligence and thoughtfulness and discernment. And as I've already said, very well qualified and well suited for the task at hand. And so we are going to look a little bit in two parts. First, we're going to talk about the audit. And then secondly, we'll go back and we'll just talk about the election integrity in general. So with that, Secretary, one of the biggest overall comments I have heard from my constituents, as I've already said, is a need and desire for a forensic audit of the 2020 election in Texas. And this was a steady drumbeat throughout the special sessions in particular, demanding, actually, there was a lot of demand that we as a legislature pass a law demanding or requiring a forensic audit. We didn't actually pass a law because, as it turned out, authority to audit already existed in statute. And I wonder if you might just talk a little bit about how this process began. The governor and you announced that an audit of the 2020 election would take place under your office, and so that puts you as the man of the hour. And I guess maybe a place to start would be, what exactly is a forensic audit? And could you talk about your office's process that you've developed and kind of where we are in the timeline of all of that?
Okay. Well, and again, thank you so much for having me. A great honor to ever get to appear with you on anything. So thank you so much for letting me be here. One of the big things, the purpose of the forensic audit is to bring election integrity and comfort amongst all voters that the vote is fair, and it's secure, and that eligible voters are the only ones casting ballots, and no one is doing anything that does anything to alter the votes that are being counted of the eligible voters. And so when we look at doing a forensic audit, as opposed to perhaps just a risk limiting audit that we already do, or the counties already do after every election, we're looking for issues within the multitude of state and federal statutory requirements that each county that puts on an election must comply with. And so many of those things are set up to create footprints in the sand that someone can't wash away very quickly or easily. And so that's what we're doing, is trying to go back through all of that information in the 4 counties that have been identified in order to get a good picture of that. So the 4 counties, the 2 largest Republican majority commissioner court counties, Collin and Tarrant, and the 2 largest counties that have Democratic majority on their commissioner's court, Harris and Dallas County, were the 4 counties selected for this forensic audit. Those represent, out of the 11 plus million votes, about 35% of those votes. So almost 4 million votes. And to put it into comparison, the Arizona audit that was done of Maricopa County was more like a recount, but that was about 2.6 million votes. So a lot smaller subset, much smaller subset of the entirety of the operations, as opposed to what we're doing here in Texas. So I know the counties have the election administrators, and Collin County is blessed with someone who is looked at as being one of the best election administrators in the state. And so it's going to be very interesting to juxtapose the different results of the counties against each other operationally, to understand better why one county felt it necessary to do some things out of the ordinary and other counties were able to do stuff that were the traditional normal route. But our forensic audit is done to be able to identify if there were any issues that rise to the level of criminal activity or potential criminal activity, to document those and then pass those over to the folks at the Texas Attorney General's office for them to follow up and decide whether to prosecute, whether there is a crime to be prosecuted or not. And that's completely different than a recount would get us. A recount really is just simply, did we count it right? And those typically in a presidential election are not going to yield any giant differential that would have swayed the election one way or the other. What we want to do with this forensic audit is find out if there were processes going on that were somehow subverting any of the processes that were supposed to take place. And if so, to identify, prosecute, and come up with fixes for those solutions, so that the next session, we will have some specific recommendations for the legislature as far as what we found. That said, our audit itself is going to be basically 2 phases. The first phase is well underway. It's made up of a list maintenance portion, which will deal in part with a settlement the state did with some plaintiffs over identifying persons who are non-citizens who have registered to vote, and then obtain a driver's license or identification card at a subsequent date. And as a result of gaining that ID card or driver's license, it's learned that those persons were not citizens when they received their registration to vote. So that's one process that's going on. That's been pared down to around 11,000 names. And I don't know that that's public, but by the same token, it doesn't need to be private. We have distributed those to the various counties. What we found in the past is sometimes someone would identify that they're not a U.S. citizen on their application. They would say no, but the counties would go ahead and register them to vote. Well, we don't want someone in that situation to ever be referred for criminal prosecution. So that's why we've sent it to the counties who have the applications for registration to vote. And we're waiting for those responses back from them on that. The other part is identifying persons who voted in 2 different states. And so we have identified a subset of voters who, at least on the surface, appear to have potentially voted both in Texas and in other states. And that information, we're having to work with other states, and then within those states, many times counties within those states. So that's the first part of the audit. We anticipate we'll have a report out on that before the end of this year. So in December, we are hopeful to have parts of the second part of the audit, which is the much more detail on, were there any issues with the mail-in ballots? Were there any issues with the in-person ballots? Were there security issues with any of the machines? It's almost a 13-page single-spaced list of items that will be examined and requested from each of these 4 counties. And so that's kind of a broad, not trying to eat up your whole show, but it's a huge undertaking, but it's one that I think is necessary in order to restore confidence in our elections.
So is it fair to say, John, that a forensic audit is kind of, it's an investigation? It's an investigation, more or less, looking at is there potential criminal activity or activity that would rise to the point of either voter fraud or something that is subverting the goal of, again, that you've got every legal vote cast counting and nothing but that counting.
It is, but we're trying to do it we're going into it with an open mind. We're literally have a blank perspective, a neutral perspective on this. We're not hoping to find something. We're not hoping to not find something. What we are trying to do is when we find something, we're going to document it as evidence, and we're going to identify. And so if we find someone who has illegally voted, an ineligible voter, we're going to make sure that they're canceled out of the rolls, the voter rolls, and we're going to turn their name over to the Attorney General's office for prosecution. So we are going to let the evidence lead us where it does, and then we're going to document that for a report, and we're going to be fully transparent for everyone along the way. There is not going to be any of this information that somehow is going to be kept away from the public.
Well, I think that's, transparency is sort of the minimum, right? It's the minimum for the way the government should operate. It should be transparent because that in and of itself covers a multitude of sins, right? If things are transparent, then there is much less incentive for people to, well, they're going to get caught, right? If things are transparent. And so, I spoke with the Attorney General a little earlier this afternoon as I was thinking about our call tonight. And, he doesn't have, the Attorney General in Texas, and every state is different. For those of you on the call, you may or may not know this. Every state is a little different. But the Attorney General in Texas only has, or what they call original jurisdiction, meaning they can actually initiate the proceedings, the investigation and the case, et cetera, on just a handful of things. But one of them is on elections. And they have 4 attorneys, that's it, in their elections divisions to work on all of this. But there's quite a backlog because these cases are not violent crimes. They have been kind of, backlogged, so that in the backlog of all of the COVID slowdown in proceedings in courts, they've kind of gotten pushed to the back of the line. But there are 500 counts that are actually right now being prosecuted. Waiting to be prosecuted. 500 counts of voter fraud or election crime. And there are 300 counts under investigation. So, sometimes we hear people say, oh, there is no such thing, but we do know that these things happen, and they get referred to the Attorney General's office. But what you're looking at is sort of the big picture, the systemic look at that, and what we can learn from these 4 counties then can be extrapolated so that it's not happening in other counties as well.
I think that's absolutely right. The law of large numbers. You're talking about 35% of all votes that were cast in the last presidential election will be analyzed, essentially the processes that went into casting those votes.
Great.
Which is a great snapshot.
Yes, it is. Brian, do we have any questions from the chat?
Yes, we do. Let's go to Tim Bates. Tim, please ask your question. Unmute yourself and ask your question. All right, I will read Tim's question. It says, will the auditors have any type of subpoena power to call election officials to ask questions?
So, Tim, we do not have subpoena power. We do not need subpoena power. We have authority under the election code to request the information we are requesting from the counties. The counties have a legal obligation to maintain these records for 22 months after the election was completed. And the request for the information, once it goes out, their obligation to comply with us is, well, to do so, to fail to do so puts them at risk for their ability to pursue independence in the future on things. So we've got a bunch of different ways to get the information. If they don't comply according to law, we then have the ability to go into court and mandamus those materials from them, or we have the ability to have a hearing in Senate State Affairs or in the House and have that information subpoenaed by those entities. So we've got a number of ways, and we don't think that's going to be an issue at all.
Yeah, I was just asking the question, Brian, to find out if they found anything that was criminal and they weren't forthcoming with some types of, answers, whether or not they could be subpoenaed and forced to provide that information. So I think I got what I need. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you for your question, Tim. Next question is going to come from, and hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly, sir, John Sefcik. John, please unmute and ask your question of Secretary Scott.
Hello, yeah, John Sefcik here. Yes, will you be able to use citizen volunteers to assist in the audit in any way? For instance, if there's a canvass or some other activity.
Well, right now, we've not looked at trying to do that. And part of that is because it's a criminal it could be a criminal investigation. We have to really be very careful about who's acquiring the evidence and how it's pursued. Now, I would say this, that I would encourage everyone on this Zoom call to become active at the precinct level as well, and being out there and maybe volunteering to be an election judge or an alternate judge or in some capacity in these elections, because I think that's at the core of stopping any kind of election fraud, is making sure that our citizens volunteer to help identify it. If they identify it, say something.
Thank you very much, Secretary Scott, and thank you very much, Mr. Sefcik. Next question is from Joseph Cruz. Joseph, go ahead, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, yes, thank you. I apologize first because I haven't really been focusing on this all that much, but if I'm not mistaken, it seems that some of the penalties were reduced to a misdemeanor level, and it seems like, this being so important, it should have been put back up to felony. And are there any plans to change that? Do we need to call a special session? I spoke with Seth Keshel in San Antonio this weekend. He was really adamant about how the results, especially in Collin County, did not match any of the data that he was tracking on the demographics. And it was troubling enough when he showed it to me. It was like, it was like night and day. How do we, I'm trying to get data from him to try to get that out to people too, so that they can take a look at that and compare it and maybe use that in their analysis. But what do we do about the charging, the criminal penalties that, because I think it's really important to get that back up.
I'll hit
Thank
that
you.
real quick. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that in the second part of the call, Joseph. But that's a question a lot of people have asked. We actually came back, the Senate actually came back to restore that. There was one specific charge that the penalty changed. And we did go back and try to do that. The House did not take it up. And so I think it is definitely, on the list of things that we will do when we go back into session. I know you can fully expect us to do it again in the session and carry that legislation. Going to the other with the numbers matching. I don't know, John, did you have any thoughts on the other part of Joseph's comment or question?
That will be, so an analysis will be going into what we gather from the counties. Part and parcel will be kind of a historical perspective, but we're able to get into the details of, to make sure that the signature logs match up to the number of ballots in the box. I mean, it literally, we will be testing to make sure that the counties ensured that every security provision was taken care of, and when it's not, we'll identify it and we'll let everybody in the public know what it was. I mean, so hopefully we'll be able to have any kind of information, and it gets back to this other. If you think that y'all have identified something, let us know. We are open. Look, we don't think we've got all the answers by any stretch of the imagination. So to the extent people have an idea that would be helpful, would love you to provide that to us, and we can pass that information on, an email address on over, so we can get that information sent to us. So
Yes, I've asked,
time or however.
I've asked Captain Keschel to send me that data, so I'm still waiting on it, but I'll pass it on when I get it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. That was Joseph
thanks, Joseph.
Cruz. We had a question about where do we send information about voter fraud? Is there contact information? Who should we be contacting?
So there is, and I tell you what, let me look at my phone. So I've got a whole 2 weeks on the job here. Yeah, so I apologize. And and I tell you what if we have that put on the chat? Does everybody get that? Can we do that? And then
Yes,
Sam from my office is watching, and Sam, if you could get that and provide that, that would be super.
Terrific. The next question will be from Lynette Amar. Lynette, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. I'll just scroll back up to see what my question was about canvassing. I also follow Captain Seth Keschel. A lot of the other counties in the country that have found fraud were canvassing. And that was my question, was about, are we going to canvass to look at the precincts, dial into the precinct level to find out, are there 20 votes coming from an empty vacant parking lot? Or was there ballot harvesting at nursing homes, like what happened in Racine, Wisconsin? It seems like the canvassing is helpful in some places. So I was just curious if we're doing that.
Yes, ma'am. That'll absolutely be a part of it when we find irregularities. So for instance, Houston, there was some testimony during this last special session about an 1,800 vote differential in the signatures and the ballots. And so that's something we'll dig down into an enormous amount. But that's what we're looking for, those irregularities, so that we spend our time following that up to find out why that is and how it occurred and who participated in allowing it to occur.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
It's a great question. Thank you.
We have another question about do you know why there are only 4 attorneys in the Office of the Attorney General that are dedicated to election fraud?
I will just say that one of the things that the Office of the Attorney General has requested is to increase the number of lawyers that they have. So that's a funding issue. But I think that, you look at the number of cases. I mean, to me, just the number that we have right now, it warrants a little more attention than they're able to give. Now, when you talk about 500 counts and 300 counts, that's not 500 necessarily 500 different people or 300 different people. That's a number of counts. So you can sometimes have, one person that has 5 counts, 5 different violations or alleged violations. So just to give a little bit of clarity around that, but that is a funding issue.
All right, thank you, Senator. We're going to take a question from Mimers. Ramirez, unmute yourself, please, and ask your question.
Good evening, everybody. This is Miguel Matis from Precinct 232.
Hey, Miguel, welcome.
Hey, hi. Good evening. How you doing, sir? So my question is really just around security. If anyone's going to be, well, it's really 2 parts, but the main focus is security. If anyone's going to be looking at how ESNS conducts their security, because I had asked one of the reps if they used specific tech username and passwords or had specific username and password per tech. And his answer was he pointed at one of the machines that we were looking at, and he said, for that machine, yes, but for these machines, and he pointed at the DS200, he said they used one username and password for everybody. And that seemed kind of like a poor security practice. And then the other point that I was going to make was, is anyone going to look into if it's possible to transfer data to one of those tabulation machines via the modem using an Ethernet cable, even with an encrypted USB drive inserted on the tabulator? So it's all around security, really.
So a couple of things on that. The security in our elections, I think, is at the beginning and end of every election that takes place. At least what I've been able, to learn in my 2 weeks on the job. We've got the the election information security policy that each county is required to do in their election, the election system security plan, and the election security best practices that go into each of these. And so if we will absolutely be looking at any connectivity between any of these voting devices and a modem. So they're not supposed to have any connection. So that's going to be one of the first things, obviously, that we determine whether that has taken place or not. And I think that's probably one of the biggest issues that concerns a lot of voters. Are there ways after the 2020 elections, are there ways that people can alter those votes? And so that's something is going to be at the forefront of our conclusions, is finding out and being able to identify, did it happen or did it not happen? Because I think everybody, to the extent it didn't happen, we want to lay that to rest as well. I want, at the end of this audit, the goal of the audit is to identify anybody that potentially did any kind of criminal and have them prosecuted. But it's also to restore that election integrity, the confidence in our elections. Senator Paxton eloquently spoke about it. It's the foundation of our system. If we cannot feel secure in casting our ballots, then we are not going to have a security or a good feeling confidence in our system. And so we take this very, very personal. Look, I had a great life until I answered the phone and was asked to go do this job. And so I'm very honored to do it, but literally it was not on my list of things to do. But I think if in my life I could help restore election confidence, I will have served a worthy purpose. So I can only tell you I will do it with honor, and I will not do anything to dishonor the office or our great state and our results. It will be a full-throated effort from soup to nuts to evaluate every aspect of the election that took place in 2020 and provide those results for everybody in our state to look
at. Thank you, Secretary Scott. I appreciate that. And, just knowing you, I so hear your heart in that. It is this particular issue is something, Miguel, I asked Secretary Scott about before we got on the call, specifically about the cybersecurity the election. And we all know, I mean, we're seeing this. It's something that we have to pay attention to in every facet of our society. We've seen some cyber attacks in our schools, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm very glad. I think it's really critical that this is an issue that we're looking at very seriously. So thanks for the question, and thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
Senator, would you like to speak about SB1
All right.
briefly?
Yeah, and I think we'll kind of shift gears here. And again, thank you so much for walking us through the audit. So we're kind of in the middle of the two phases, just to kind of wrap that up. The list maintenance piece. So that's really cleaning up our voter rolls quite a bit, right? Which is something, I mean, everyone has talked about for such a long time. And then, of course, this second phase where really the investigation is sort of taking place. So we're moving into that now. And just by the way, being one of those 4 counties, many of the people on the call live in Collin County, and some may live in others. But have you had conversations with those counties? I mean, where are things on that part of the timeline? Just to kind of wrap up this part of the call.
So the counties, it's interesting. So I've had conversations with y'all's election administrator in Collin County. I've visited with Dallas counties and Tarrant counties. I've not visited with the Harris County folks. Their commissioner court has said they will not help or participate in the audit. I've gotten some mixed messaging that from a different source down there that said no, they're going to comply. So, but the 3 counties in North Texas have welcomed this, I think, which is refreshing. I think there's 1 or 2 that think there may be some stuff people find, not in a bad way of something criminal, but sloppiness in the record keeping. And so the determination ultimately will be what was the cause. Was it sloppiness or something else? But those are all things that, at least when you have willing participants that are, I look at as the state's partners in doing these elections, the counties who actually administer them, I think that's great. The last thing you want to hear is that somebody doesn't want to help you on something like election integrity. So yes, I've visited with them, and they have all pledged to be as helpful as possible.
Well, that is encouraging and very frustrating. And of course, of the 4 counties, it would be Harris County. Come on, Harris County, step up to the plate. We need you. So, well, let's move on to the other part of our call tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about the Senate Bill 1, which was the election bill. The center of quite a bit of attention. The Democrats, of course, walked out at the end of the session, not in order to not have to vote on it. Then they left again during the first special session. But we were able eventually to get this bill passed. Honestly, for the most part, I think that the bill improved along the process. We had a little more time to flesh out some of the features of it. But the main idea of Senate Bill 1 is to make it easier to vote. If you're a valid voter, we want to make it very simple and straightforward for you to cast your vote and have confidence in your vote counting. And we want to make it harder to cheat. A lot of the focus on preventing cheating was built around the idea of vote harvesting. And we actually defined that for the first time in statute in this bill. So it's an idea people had talked about. And of course, this is when you've got an individual or an organization that are basically going and they are collecting in some way large numbers of votes, either by using, well, there are a number of different ways to do it. This is where we talk about dead people voting, people voting maybe twice here or there, people that are not citizens voting, people voting and not being who they are, people using other people's credentials to vote, that sort of thing. So vote harvesting was actually defined in statute. But here are some of the ways we made it easier to vote. We expanded early voting hours. We required over 20 additional counties to provide, to raise their minimum number of hours to 12 hours, so that across the state now there's more uniformity. You don't have some parts of the state that are having less opportunity to vote during early voting. So I think that is a good improvement. It allows voters that are in line when the polls close during early voting to be able to vote. So if you're in line when the polls close during early voting, you can now vote. You get to stay in line and finish casting your vote. That was already true on election day, but it wasn't true, was not the case for early voting. So it extended that to also include early voting. In a similar way, the bill allows employees to be granted time off to vote early, just like they already can for election day. There is also a mail-in ballot defect curing process. And some of you know individuals, maybe elderly individuals, disabled individuals who do use mail-in ballots. My mother did that. And sometimes some of those folks, they'll leave something blank, and it's you know, it's kind of a clerical error on their part. They've overlooked something. What we put in the statute was a defect curing process. So if there was just you know, something that was skipped or overlooked or missing or couldn't be read, perhaps, the current process is just to reject the ballot. And what we put in order to take care of situations where it was, you know, just it's just too hard to read, or something was inadvertently left missing. Under SB 1, the election administrator, if time permits, they can actually contact the voter and ask them to fix the problem. Or they can cancel that mail-in ballot and allow the person to vote in person. And that helps those folks make sure that their vote counts if they are a valid voter. Some of the ways that we made it harder to cheat, of course, we now require voter identification for the mail-in ballot process. We prohibit voting from a motor vehicle, the drive-in voting, unless other than the curbside voting that already exists for people with a disability, to help them have access to casting their ballot. Ballots that are returned by hand and not mailed have to be put in person, be received in person by an election official. They cannot be put in a drop box. This is a simple chain of custody measure that's really, really important and was not followed uniformly throughout the last election. We also require that when a person is convicted of a felony, upon their conviction, felons are required now to be made aware that they cannot vote until their full sentence is served. So it's just a clarification. Listen, you know this, and it's not a secret. It's not something you can use later on that, oh, I didn't know. It makes vote harvesting a crime. And it also prohibits an early voting clerk from soliciting an application for ballot by mail or sending out applications that have not been requested. So this is the en masse early mail-in ballot that we saw, trying to get people to do mail-in ballots. Those are both now prohibited. So Secretary Scott, you're in a position in your position as Secretary of State, and very, you know, upfront and close and personal view of our elections, of course. Do you have any comments on the implementation of Senate Bill 1? For example, are these things going to be in effect when we hit our primary in our next general election? And any other comments you might just have about SB 1?
So thank you, Senator. We talked about before we went on, the other added benefit is you get sued a lot in this job. And so since SB 1 was passed by the legislature, I think we're up to 8 or 9 lawsuits over that bill. And we've got about the same number on redistricting that have been filed against the state. So some of my comments will be more broadly spoken because I think the great lawyers at the Attorney General's office who represent me in those cases have said, be careful. That said, I think the addition of the last four of the social, the last four of the driver's license adds a security level that makes it almost impossible for someone to do in large numbers, capture a bunch of mail-in ballots if someone were of the mind to try and do that. I think it was a mayor of Carrollton that a couple of years ago had a candidate for mayor of Carrollton had rented an apartment is I think the fact pattern, and was using that essentially as a fake nursing home, and was capturing all types of ballots that he was then going to use or did use. And so to have to capture those plus correctly identify the last four, I think it's a great security provision. There's a lot of states that have done mail-in ballots for a long time, and I think that's something that they've used in the past in those states to bring a higher level of security and prevent a lot of the vote harvesting that has gone on in the past. So I think that is one of the great changes that y'all accomplished. I think the other thing is the ongoing obligation to do these audits in the future. There's going to be always going forward after the 22 November election, and every 2 years, those, the midterms and the presidential, the two big ones, those are going to have the same type of forensic audit performed. And it's going to be the randomly picked 2 counties over 300,000 and 2 counties under 300,000. So that's another aspect of that. And that's one of the issues we've come up with was, as we're ramping up an entity known as the Forensic Audit Division that will be a permanent part of the Secretary of State's office, so that we're able to have folks that are just specifically focused on these issues and developing best practices, as well as the kind of lessons learned in order to be better at auditing these efforts. So I think those are great additions that y'all were able to accomplish in SB1.
Well, I like the idea of creating a division in your office for that, because, 2 things. Of course, you always learn from what happened last time, then you learn and you can incorporate that. But the other thing is people invent new ways of cheating, right? And so you always have to stay up with, try to stay ahead of individuals who are trying to subvert a fair and free election. Well, Brian, why don't we've got a few minutes left on the call. Why don't we go on and go to some questions?
You bet, Senator. We've got a question right here. It says, what are you doing to ensure that it remains easy to vote? Are voters disenfranchised under this new law?
Well, and I'll address that. There were a number of amendments that were added to make sure that we did not. And there was, that was some of the, I think, false criticism that was leveraged against the bill. But I, for example, actually carried the amendment on the floor to allow for assistance for an individual who needs assistance at the poll. And I asked if I could carry that because I did that with my mother. And many people do need assistance. They need, they may not be legally blind, but they have a hard time reading. They have a hard time making sense. I mean, there was some very moving testimony that Senator Hughes cited of a woman who just didn't understand the machine. And there was someone who came up and said that they would help her. Now, they were not her assistant. They came up and offered to help her. And they said, do this, do this, do this, do this. And they had her punch the buttons. And she said, okay, I understand. Let me do it. Let me vote for myself. And they said, you're done. And that was an example of someone posing as an assisting person who was harvesting that person's vote. And so we made sure that the person that assists is not able to basically direct the person's choice. They're there to give mechanical assistance, reading assistance, whatever, but they cannot usurp the person's choice. And we wanted to be real clear about that. But I think we've done a good job. We still have curbside voting, and I've seen that done well for many years, but we made sure that it's done in a way that helps people vote, but it doesn't allow people to usurp other people's votes. But people with disabilities have, I think, very good protection under this bill.
Thank you, Senator Paxton. We have another question that is, what did the legislature do to prevent fraud in the mail-in ballots for a person claiming a disability when they are not in fact disabled?
You know, that we actually passed, I have the bill number here, House Bill 3920. This was an issue in the last election because we had people claiming a disability because they were concerned, they would claim they were concerned about getting COVID, and they claimed that as a disability. We defined very clearly that a disability is defined as a sickness or disability that prevents a voter from appearing in person at a polling location during the voting period. That is how it is defined. Or it could also include confinement due to childbirth. So if you have an individual, a woman who is very near her due date, then that is the other. But that's a pretty verifiable thing. If a woman is very pregnant, basically a person would potentially have to sign an affidavit. They have to sign an affidavit. They have to testify basically that they fit the description. And the cure for that is that if they do not, then their ballot is rejected. That's typically been it. Their ballot doesn't count if they don't fit the description. If they lie, then it is a misdemeanor. So those are the things that we've done. That's again, House Bill 3920.
I noticed something in the comments. I saw something that Mark Brugge had said, and I was wondering, it got me thinking about his comment. Is there a checklist for a forensic audit? And should there be one? Is that something the Secretary of State would want to comment on, or?
Well, I think checklists absolutely are where we're going. We're going to be ultimately incorporating everything we do in this audit into a manual, and the manual is going to be available to anybody and everybody that wants it. And it's going to be a living document. It's going to be one that, as we learn better systems, better things to focus on, they will be added in there. But the checklist right now will be following all the different state and federal laws that the counties operate their elections under. And that's, I don't know that it's in checklist form, but I'm a huge fan of checklists in my own life. But I think that is something that at the end of this first process that we will be developing. And as we go forward with this, let me real quick give a little bit of history, because I think it's important to understand why the state has probably not done these forensic audits in the past. Because I think that was the first question I asked is, why hadn't we been doing them? It's always been an adversarial system. You have two people who are running for office, usually, or more. And if one of them sees something that looks like it's done incorrectly, that's the system by which they've raised a flag and said, wait a second, my opponent's cheated or someone on their behalf has cheated. And then there is a process by which historically the Secretary of State's office, as well as the contestants themselves in the election, have been able to kind of ferret out whether there was something that would alter that election. But it's always really been focused on a specific election for a specific office. This is much broader, obviously. And so the infrastructure is there. We understand the statutes that are there and the ability to go use them. They're just simply being used in a different way at this point in time, a way that we've never really tried to do in the past. But this is great, because I think in doing so, we will create something that I really think will be at the forefront of every state in the United States to copy. So that's our goal. And I think we'll meet that goal. But
Well,
yes, checklist, absolutely.
I think that's a great summary, really, too, of where we're going with all of this. And I appreciate you bringing the context there, because really these kinds of things have always kind of worked themselves out in the specific elections, in the contests, right? And what we're dealing with now is much bigger. It's more systemic, and it's the world we live in. And I just appreciate that you've been willing to step up to the task. I'm glad everyone tonight has gotten to see a real live Secretary of State in person. When you hear the name John Scott, you'll know who that is. And I did want to mention, we talked a little earlier, Secretary Scott, you mentioned that you encouraged people to be involved in volunteering in the elections, because again, that kind of goes back to when we've got a lot of accountability, lots of eyes, right? And then when you see something, you have the ability to speak to it yourself. Not, I heard this happen, you saw it, and you're actually a person that can give your eyewitness testimony about something that concerns you. And you may be protecting some people's votes, and that would be really important. If you do have examples of voter fraud or something that concerns you, I did want to just let you know, you can always send those to me, and I'm happy to get them to Secretary Scott's office, angela.paxton@senate.texas.gov, angela.paxton@senate.texas.gov. And I don't know, do we have Secretary Scott's email address? Was that put in the chat? We might say it out loud too, just for the podcast, if anyone has that.
Yeah, okay. I can give you my my email address there at the office. I may get more than a couple of emails a day this way, but please, it's jscott@sos.texas, all spelled out, .gov, G-O-V.
There you go.
I'm y'all's public servant too, so please, I'm not saying I'm still washing cars for everybody, but I'm happy to do any to follow up with you.
Oh, I didn't know you did that. I didn't know you ever did that. But I tell you what, it really is just shows your servant's heart, though, that you were willing to come on the call tonight and speak to some great folks in Collin and Dallas counties for sure, and I'm sure in some of the others. But these folks are my constituents for the most part, and I just appreciate you being willing to take time out of your evening to speak directly to what is happening with the forensic audit. I know there's kind of been a lot of mystery around it, not a purposeful mystery, but just because, it's new. And I really appreciate you being so honest and transparent with us about where we are in the process. And anyway, please let me know, Secretary Scott, how I can be of assistance to your office, and if there's anything we can help with up here in Collin County.
Senator, thank you so much for having me tonight. It's been an absolute honor to be on the program with you, and anytime, let me know, and I'm happy to be anywhere y'all need me to be.
Well, thank you. And to everyone who's been on the call tonight, thank you all so much. Thanks for the great questions and thoughtful questions. And I just appreciate you being part of this with me. It's so helpful for me to hear your questions. This is our listen, learn, lead format. And I think that's just how it works. We listen, all of us, as we listen to each other, right? We learn, and that puts us in a good position so that we can really make good decisions, and we can lead well in a way that is effective and productive and positive for our own lives and our kids and our grandkids. So thank you all for being with us tonight, and hope you'll stay in touch. AngelaPaxton.com. You can stay up with what's next. Looking forward to a couple of events out in Rains County and Hunt County in the next few days, new parts of Senate District 8. But thank you all again. Have a great night, and God bless you.
Good night.
Thank you, Secretary. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Good night.